Just to recap, a private equity fund is 10 years in length. At the beginning of the fund, it finds companies and buys companies. And slowly over time, it creates value and sells companies. If we graph this out, it creates what is known as the J-curve in private equity. Well, private equity secondaries buyers can mitigate the J-curve by investing in a private equity fund through a secondary transaction, where it can buy into a private equity fund in the middle of the fund. This is what Ardian did with 20 of the funds that CPP Investments invested in. To make sure you understand, let's look at this another way, going back to first principles. LPs stand for the limited partners, or the investors, in the private equity fund, and the GP stands for the general partner, or the private equity firm in the private equity fund. And a private equity secondary transaction is when an LP sells its interest in a private equity fund to another LP. In our example, CPP Investments was one of the limited partners, and Ardian was the other LP. But this wasn't just for one fund. It was for 20 private equity funds. So CPP Investments sold 20 limited partnership interests to Ardian. In this video, we will go into more details on private equity secondaries. We will talk about blind pool risk, discounts to NAV, and secondaries in 2023. And we'll end the video with a final thought. So let's get started with blind pool risk. If you're investing in a newly raised private equity fund, it is said that you are investing in a blind pool because the private equity fund has no investments at the time that the fund is raised. In other words, as an investor in a private equity fund, you cannot conduct any due diligence on existing fund investments because the fund has no investments. For more information on how to conduct due diligence on a new private equity fund, please check out our video titled 7 Things to Look For When Investing in a Private Equity Fund. In a private equity secondary transaction, since a secondary transaction occurs after the fund has made investments, the fund has companies that a buyer can value. In fact, every quarter, a private equity fund will come up with a NAV, or net asset value of the fund, which is based on the value of the underlying assets. We will discuss how accurate the NAV is later in this video. But for now, just know that the NAV, or net asset value, is the value of the assets in the fund. So let's move on to discounts to NAV. The NAV of a private equity fund is usually calculated every 3 months and tends to be a lot stickier than the prices in the public markets. This NAV is usually approved by an independent party. Now, I gave my opinion on independent parties in private equity fund valuations, specifically in GP-led secondaries, in our video titled Breaking Down the 2023 SEC Private Equity Regulations. So please check out that video to learn more. When the public markets fall and the private equity fund NAV don't fall as quickly, remember they're sticky, private equity secondary transactions usually trade at a discount to NAV. Or in other words, the price of a private equity secondary transaction will be priced less than the net asset value reported by the fund. In 2022, according to Jefferies, percentages of NAVs traded on the secondaries markets for buyouts were 87% of NAV, a discount of 13%, while percentages of NAVs for real estate and venture capital were around 70%. That's a 30% discount to NAV. I believe that the large discounts to NAV were due to investors believing that NAVs were inflated, but also to recessionary fears and global uncertainty that motivated LPs to liquidate their interests. So let's move on to secondaries in 2023. The markets have improved in 2023 and discounts to NAV in private equity have reduced. But one thing that I'd like to mention is the growth in private credit secondaries. Since the global financial crisis, after Dodd-Frank was introduced, and restricted bank lending, the private credit industry has grown rapidly. Now that these private credit funds have been around for a while, there has been a growing secondary market for these funds since investors have been needing more liquidity. There have been some challenges in the private credit secondary market since GPs may also be secondary buyers. So some private credit GPs have restricted buyer lists where they will block LPs from selling on the secondary market to certain buyers who may be their competitors. Overall, though, the private credit secondary market is growing. Now, one thing not to forget is that the private credit industry has really only been sizable since the global financial crisis. The industry hasn't been tested, so it'll be interesting to see how things will play out in the private credit secondary market if markets go in a different direction. Now, here's a final thought. Investors, private equity secondaries could be a good investment. They mitigate the J-curve, mitigate blind pool risk, and you may be able to buy at a discount to NAV. With that said, there are many details you need to understand before you make a secondary investment. So make sure to do your due diligence.